The deafening shriek of the smoke alarm shattered the silence of the night. Flames licked hungrily at the edges of the hallway, casting an eerie orange glow across the walls. Sarah's heart pounded as she felt something tugging urgently at her sleeve. A frantic German shepherd named Max, his amber eyes wide with panic. The air was thick with acrid smoke, clawing at her throat and stinging her eyes. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. Every second mattered, and Max wasn't letting go. Still half asleep, Sarah stumbled out of bed, coughing violently as the toxic fumes filled her lungs. Her vision blurred and her thoughts were a jumble of confusion and fear. What was happening? Where was the fire coming from? Through tear-filled eyes, she saw Max standing by her side, his teeth clenched tightly around her pajama sleeve. His refusal to let go grounded her, forcing her to focus on survival instead of succumbing to panic. As Sarah fought to steady herself, flashes of her life flooded back. The months of unemployment, the weight of raising 2 kids alone, the loneliness that had settled over her like a heavy fog. Adopting Max had been an impulsive decision, born out of desperation, a way to fill the void left by her crumbling world. But now, as he stood beside her, steadfast and determined, she wondered if fate had brought them together for this very moment. Despite everything, she couldn't deny how much stronger she'd felt since bringing him home. Outside, the winter night pressed against the windows, its icy breath sealing off any chance of quick escape. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling all sounds except the relentless blare of the smoke alarm. The isolation made the danger feel even more suffocating. Every step towards safety would be a battle, not just against the fire, but against the freezing wilderness waiting beyond their door. Sarah shivered, not just from the cold seeping through the walls, but from the realization that they were truly on their own. Following Max's insistent lead, Sarah hesitated for a brief second, memories flooding back of the day she first met him. How wild and broken he'd seemed, how unsure she'd been about taking him in. Back then, she'd doubted whether she could handle another responsibility, let alone one so unpredictable. Yet here he was, pulling her towards salvation, proving that trust wasn't given lightly. This moment, chaotic and terrifying as it was, would redefine everything she thought she knew about resilience, loyalty, and love. Sarah stood outside the animal shelter, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets as she hesitated. A friend had suggested adopting a pet, claiming it might help lift her spirits after months of unemployment and loneliness. But Sarah wasn't so sure. How could she take care of another living being when she barely managed to keep herself afloat? Still, guilt gnawed at her. She'd promised her kids they'd consider getting a dog someday. With a sigh, she pushed open the door, stepping into the faintly antiseptic-scented air of the shelter. The kennels lined the walls, each holding animals with their own stories etched in their eyes. Most wagged their tails or barked hopefully, but one caught Sarah's attention immediately. In the far corner, a German shepherd cowered, his matted fur sticking out in uneven patches. His amber eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding direct contact. It was clear he'd been through something terrible. Neglect, maybe worse. Something about his posture tugged at Sarah's heart, even though logic screamed that taking him home would only add to her struggles. She lingered by his kennel longer than she intended, watching as he shifted uneasily on the cold floor. He didn't bark or whine like the others. Instead, he seemed frozen, as if expecting rejection. Against her better judgment, Sarah knelt down, pressing her palm against the metal bars. "Hey there," she murmured softly, unsure whether he'd retreat or lash out. To her surprise, his ears twitched slightly, though he remained rooted in place. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of longing, that made her hesitate before walking away. Summoning courage she didn't know she had, Sarah extended her hand further, letting it hover just beyond the bars. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Max leaned forward, but flinched back sharply before making contact, Her breath hitched, but then she noticed what mattered most. He hadn't growled or snapped. Instead, his tail gave the faintest thump against the ground. It was such a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes. Maybe this broken soul needed her as much as she secretly needed him. After signing the adoption papers, Sarah loaded Max into her car, his body tense and rigid beside her. The drive home felt endless, filled with awkward silences, punctuated by his nervous panting. As they pulled into the driveway, Sarah glanced at him, wondering if she'd made a mistake. Could she really handle this? Would he ever trust her? These questions swirled in her mind as she led him inside, both of them stepping cautiously into an uncertain future together. Max's first few days at home were rocky. Thunderstorms sent him pacing anxiously, his sharp barks echoing through the house. Strangers at the door triggered panic, causing him to bolt under furniture or bare his teeth defensively. Sarah tried everything: calming tones, treats, gentle pats, but progress came slowly, if at all. Doubt crept back in. Was she equipped to heal someone so damaged? Each setback tested her resolve, but she refused to give up entirely. Amid the chaos, tiny moments began to shine through. One evening, as Sarah sat on the couch reading, Max nudged her arm with his nose, resting his head tentatively on her lap. Another time, when a delivery man approached the house, Max planted himself firmly between Sarah and the stranger, his protective stance surprising her. These fleeting acts of affection and loyalty hinted at the bond forming between them, a fragile thread that neither fully understood but both desperately needed. Sarah poured every ounce of patience she had into helping Max heal. She took him on long walks through quiet trails, letting him set the pace as he sniffed curiously at trees and patches of grass. At home, they worked on simple obedience commands: sit, stay, come, rewarding each tiny success with treats and praise. Evenings were spent by the fire, where Sarah would sit cross-legged on the rug, inviting Max to join her. At first, he kept his distance, but over time he inched closer, drawn by the warmth of both the flames and her presence. One day, as Sarah tossed a ball across the yard, something remarkable happened. Max's tail wagged. Not just a tentative flick, but a full, joyful sweep. It was small, yet monumental. That night, when Sarah settled onto the couch with a book, Max curled up beside her instead of retreating to his bed in the corner. These subtle shifts filled her with hope, proof that their bond was growing stronger with each passing day. The storm hit without warning, plunging the house into darkness. The sudden loss of electricity sent Max into a frenzy. He paced anxiously, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah knelt beside him, speaking softly as she stroked his back. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, her voice steady despite her own unease. Slowly, his trembling subsided, and he pressed himself closer to her, seeking comfort. In that moment, Sarah realized how much he trusted her now, and how much she relied on his steadiness too. The power outage marked a turning point in their relationship. For Max, it was the first time he truly leaned on someone else for reassurance. For Sarah, it deepened her understanding of how intertwined their lives had become. When the lights flickered back on hours later, Max stayed close, resting his head on her lap. She smiled, running her fingers through his fur. They weren't just owner and pet anymore. They were partners, learning to navigate life's uncertainties together. As winter dragged on, financial pressures loomed larger than ever. Bills piled up, and Sarah found herself staring at bank statements late at night, wondering if she could afford to keep Max. Could she justify the cost of food, vet visits, and everything else when her own future felt so uncertain? Guilt gnawed at her. How could she even consider giving him up after all they'd been through? Yet practicality whispered cruel truths, leaving her torn between love and responsibility. Just as doubt threatened to overwhelm her, Max did something extraordinary. While walking near the park, he darted ahead and returned moments later, holding a leather wallet in his mouth. Inside was an ID card belonging to a man who dropped it earlier. Another time, Max barked insistently at the window, alerting Sarah to a stranger lurking suspiciously near their fence. His actions reminded her of his unwavering devotion, reinforcing her commitment to him. He wasn't just a burden, he was family. Despite their growing bond, strange things began happening around the house. Lights flickered unpredictably, outlets sparked, and appliances short-circuited one by one. Sarah dismissed them as minor annoyances at first, too focused on Max to dwell on the oddities. But deep down, a nagging worry lingered. Something wasn't right, though neither she nor Max could fully grasp what was coming. Their peaceful routine masked an undercurrent of impending chaos. The electrical issues grew worse, but Sarah pushed them to the back of her mind, choosing instead to focus on the joy Max brought into her life. She laughed as he chased after a tennis ball, his tail wagging furiously, or cuddled next to her during movie nights. The warning signs were there. The faint smell of smoke from the basement, the hum of overloaded circuits. But she ignored them, unwilling to let fear overshadow the happiness they'd built together. Little did she know, disaster was closer than she thought. Late one snowy night, the house was eerily quiet, until a faint crackling sound broke the stillness. Faulty wiring in the basement sparked a fire, orange flames licking hungrily at the wooden beams. Within moments, thick smoke began to fill the air, creeping silently through the vents and under doorways. The fire spread with terrifying speed, its heat radiating through the walls as it consumed everything in its path. Sarah, asleep upstairs, had no idea of the danger brewing below. Before the smoke alarms even blared, Max sprang into action. His sharp bark cut through the silence like a knife, jolting Sarah awake. She sat up groggily, disoriented, but Max didn't give her time to process. He tugged urgently at her sleeve with his teeth, his eyes wide with panic. "Max, what is it?" she murmured, her voice heavy with sleep. But he wouldn't stop barking or pulling, his frantic energy impossible to ignore. Something was terribly wrong. As Sarah stumbled out of bed, the acrid smell of smoke hit her hard. Her heart sank when she saw flickers of orange light creeping up the staircase. The fire had already spread upstairs, cutting off parts of the hallway. Panic surged through her as she realized her children were sleeping in another room down the hall. Should she try to save them, or escape while she still could? Every second felt like an eternity, the weight of the decision crushing her. Sarah hesitated, frozen by fear, but Max refused to let her stand there. He grabbed her sleeve again, this time yanking her toward the kids' bedroom with determined strength. His loyalty was unshakable. He wasn't going to leave without them. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she followed him, clutching his collar tightly. In that moment, she understood. They were in this together, and Max would lead the way if she let him. The hallway was a nightmare. Thick black smoke stung their eyes and lungs, and the heat pressed against their skin like an oppressive force. Visibility was nearly zero, but Max moved forward confidently, his keen sense of smell guiding them through the chaos. Sarah stayed close, trusting him completely now, her hand gripping his fur as they pushed deeper into the inferno. Each step felt like a battle against time, the roar of the flames growing louder behind them. Max stopped abruptly outside the kids' bedroom, pawing at the door with urgency. Sarah fumbled with the handle, coughing violently as she swung it open. Inside, her two children lay asleep, oblivious to the danger. She scooped them up quickly, her arms trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Just as they turned to leave, flames burst through the walls behind them, forcing them to run faster than ever before. With Max leading the way, they raced back toward the front door. The house groaned around them, its structure weakening under the intense heat. As they burst outside into the freezing snow, part of the roof collapsed behind them in a deafening crash. Sarah collapsed to her knees, gasping for fresh air, her children clinging to her tightly. Max stood beside them, panting heavily but alert, his body shielding them from the wind. In the icy darkness, Sarah clutched her sobbing children to her chest, her own tears streaming freely. She looked at Max, who stood guard protectively despite his obvious exhaustion. For the first time, she fully understood the depth of his bravery and devotion. He hadn't just saved her, he'd saved her entire family. In that moment, any lingering doubts about their bond vanished. Max wasn't just a pet, he was a hero, a true partner in every sense of the word. The wail of sirens pierced the night as firefighters arrived, their red lights flashing against the snowy backdrop. They worked swiftly, dousing the flames with powerful jets of water until the inferno was finally extinguished. Neighbors gathered around, wrapping Sarah and her children in warm blankets and offering words of comfort. The immediate danger had passed, but the shock lingered. As she stood there, clutching her kids tightly, Sarah realized just how close they'd come to tragedy, and how much Max had done to save them all. In the freezing snow, Sarah knelt beside Max, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him fiercely. Her mind replayed the events of the night, how he'd alerted her to the fire, refused to let her hesitate, and led them safely to her children. It wasn't just instinct, it was bravery born from loyalty and love. She looked into his weary eyes and whispered, "You saved us." In that moment, she understood that Max wasn't just a companion, he was family. As news of the fire spread, neighbors rallied around Sarah and her family, offering food, clothes, and temporary shelter. One couple even invited them to stay in their guest house until they could rebuild. The outpouring of kindness reminded Sarah of the goodness in people, mirroring the unconditional love Max had shown her. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Their small community became a lifeline, helping them navigate the aftermath of the disaster. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and her family began piecing their lives back together. They salvaged what they could from the charred remains of their home and started planning its reconstruction. Each day brought new challenges, but also moments of gratitude for surviving, for their supportive neighbors, and most of all, for Max. His presence gave them strength, a constant reminder that even after loss, life could begin anew. Word of Max's heroic actions quickly spread throughout the neighborhood. People stopped Sarah on the street to praise him, calling him a true hero. Children wanted to pet him, and adults shared stories of their own pets' loyalty. Max seemed to carry his newfound fame with quiet dignity, his tail wagging proudly whenever someone thanked him. He had become more than a dog. He was a symbol of courage and resilience, inspiring everyone who heard his story. As Sarah reflected on everything they'd been through, she marveled at how far both she and Max had come since those uncertain days when she first adopted him. Back then, she doubted whether she could heal him or herself, but now they were inseparable. Their bond had grown stronger through every challenge, proving that trust and love could transform even the hardest hearts. Max had taught her resilience, and she in turn had given him a second chance at happiness. On Christmas morning, Sarah surprised Max with a shiny new collar engraved with the word "Hero." As he wagged his tail and leaned into her embrace, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This simple gift wasn't just a token of appreciation. It was a testament to their unbreakable bond. Through trials and triumphs, they had found each other, and in doing so, discovered the true meaning of companionship and love. As Sarah sat by the fireplace in their newly rebuilt home, she reflected on the day she first brought Max into her life. He had been a broken spirit then, wary, skittish, and scarred by his past. Yet, through patience and compassion, they had both healed. Adopting him wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a second chance for them both. She realized now that trust wasn't given lightly, it was earned, step by fragile step. Max's resilience had taught Sarah more than she ever expected. His ability to overcome fear and trauma inspired her to face her own struggles with renewed strength. Through every challenge, the financial hardships, the emotional battles, they had leaned on each other. Unconditional love, she learned, wasn't just about giving, it was about growing together, becoming stronger because of one another. Sarah thought back to the loneliness that once consumed her before Max came into her life. Opening her heart to him hadn't just saved him, it had saved her too. In caring for him, she found purpose, joy, and a sense of belonging. Their bond reminded her that connection, no matter how small, could fill even the deepest voids. Love, whether human or animal, had the power to make you whole again. Max's actions during the fire still lingered in her mind. Despite his own fears, he had risked everything to save her family. It was a reminder that heroism wasn't defined by grand gestures, but by selfless acts born out of love. Those who had suffered the most, like Max, often carried the greatest capacity for bravery, the truth that humbled her deeply. In the quiet moments, Sarah understood something profound. No one is truly alone when they open their hearts to another. Whether human or animal, companionship has the power to heal wounds and light up the darkest corners of our lives. For Sarah, Max wasn't just a dog. He was proof that love knows no boundaries, and that we're all connected in ways deeper than words can express.